Well, let's go to on your website. You can find it's actually, I think it's a PDF that's posted. Yes, we can post the PowerPoint if for some reason you would want it for your, but listed as a PDF right now. It's probably, I'm going to probably skip through it a little bit because I just want to kind of hit some of the highlights. But I think it gets back to this whole concept of inquiry, and I think student motivation, which then is also tied to helping students feel like a part of the system and be involved and so on. So I wanted to, you have the PowerPoint, good, you can click on the link. So I actually am pulling a little bit of this. Some of this I'm pulling out from what we've been doing with the social studies group in day one, because inquiry is a big part of social studies. It's a big part also of the science work, but we don't always think about it as it's really part of everything. It should be a part of every content area. So while I'm going to use a couple of social studies examples with you and maybe pull in a little bit of others, I think you also, and there's also a science clip we'll see here. I think it's in middle school kids in some kind of a research-based project. It's basically about the way we interact with kids every day around everything they do in the classroom. So it's about becoming students, becoming really good learners. I took a few quotes out from what inquiry-based units are about. And again, I took the slide from what we're doing in the social studies group. So at the bottom, instead of bringing history to life, it's really about bringing the content to life. Inquiry is about making it real for kids. And so some quotes that I pulled from some several places, but it's really about getting kids to ask and answer and questions that really get them to dig into the content that you want to teach, and getting them to be so deeply engaged that they're actually paying attention to what we're doing. So a couple of documents that are in the PowerPoint, we're not going to flags that we had for science and math and language arts, but also we developed a green flags, red flags for social studies. So a couple of pieces of that I think you could take off to, if you just took the social studies references out, it could apply to any content area that you have in terms of, you know, are we asking the right questions of kids that really get them to be great inquirers, to get them to want to understand and want to learn and to investigate the content that you have. So take the social studies references out and we still have what's really good instruction that's going to be deeply engaging for kids and deeply motivating for kids. And then another, there's a couple of other parts of the green flags, red flags, but the other one I wanted to share with you specifically was on engaging in rigorous student-centered learning, which is one of the shifts for social studies, but also is something we want to consider for all content areas. And again, if we look at through this, there's not a, if we take out any references to a content area, we can put any content area into this document to really say, do we have that student-centered learning that's rigorous, but also becomes motivating for kids? So if we took a look at the social studies inquiry anchor standards, and these are the ones we're going to be talking about deeply and kind of taking a deep dive into Thursday and Friday with the social studies teachers. If you took off social studies, and I almost did that with the slide, but wanted to make sure you understood where they came from. If you look at those 6 anchor standards, and they go K-12, this isn't just something you do with kids, upper middle school and high school. This is things you're doing with kids at all levels. Asking, having compelling questions that we ask them, and then having them do their own constructing and supporting questions, and gathering evidence, using sources, using text of all types to gather evidence and to develop claims based on that evidence, and then communicating and critiquing, evaluating conclusions that are drawn from that, and taking some kind of action from that. So I think even though these are part of the social studies standards, I think they really frame what we want them to do in science, what we want them to do in every content area. If you look at the Iowa Core social studies standards for inquiry, we have a document, and you see this document here where it takes those 6 anchor standards and gives you an idea of what that looks like all the way through high school. So on the first, and what the yellow is what's the new part? What's like the, how is it moving forward? How is it growing? How is that standard growing across time? So we can see how inquiry, for example, in gathering and evaluating sources, we can look at what that looks like across and as it grows, and onto the second page, how it grows into high school in terms of the kind of skill we're building with each of those inquiry pieces. So whether it's, you know, take social studies off of it, take any allusions to social studies off, and you really have a document for diving into what does inquiry look like at different levels. So I'm going to show you a little YouTube clip, and hopefully we can click. I mean, we have to. Yeah. Okay. Oops. Nope. It didn't. We might have to take a quick piece here to copy, because I did make it a live link. Obviously, I thought I had, but didn't. So we're gonna take a quick look at why this is important. Now, I think it's a. Oops. If we can't get to that one, we can go to the next one too. Okay. We're gonna quickly open that up. In addition to the clip that we're going to watch, there are 4 clips. I'll kind of talk about them. Jamie's getting an education department on what does inquiry look like. And what I like is they're very short, but they do give us a really clear picture of what inquiry looks like, not at this really... Okay, so that's kind of the lead in to the next ones we have that I believe are linked. So as we go back, I think the important thing is these goals. How many of them look like some of those first pictures that we saw? When I've done some, you know, over the years when I've done classroom visits, I see some of that exact thing, kids with their heads down, not paying attention, doing other things because they're not really engaged in the learning. So I also included in the PowerPoint 4 videos that came from the Ontario Science Education, Ontario, Canada, Science Education group, ministry, whatever. And I like them because they're short and sweet. They'll probably be worked into an inquiry-based, or maybe even added to the one. By the way, when I did the micro-credential on inquiry for social studies, I tried to leave as much of the allusions and the references to social studies out. So even though it's in the social studies topic area, it's really a micro-credential that everybody could use. So in the YouTube series, so the first one's only 3 minutes long. So I'm going to go ahead and have you watch it because it shows 2nd grade and it kind of gives us some ideas of what we do that doesn't have to be like a big project-based kind of thing, but really is getting kids into just the way we ask questions. So we'll take a look at that. Let's see if my link worked. Please. Okay. It's just that for some reason Jamie's computer is very tired today. There we go. I think Zoom takes a lot of energy.
Incorporating inquiry-based learning into your classroom can seem like many things. Expensive.
All right, everyone. Now that we're done playing with liquid nitrogen, we're gonna build a vacuum cannon.
Too open-ended.
I made a ball tape.
Intimidating.
Can a black hole just without an event horizon?
Or perhaps even simply time-consuming.
I'm sorry, we don't have time to go over that right now. There's actually a famous St. Bernard named Barry, and Barry has been found to have rescued about 70 people.
Inquiry-based learning doesn't have to be any of these things. In fact, inquiry-based learning is a very good thing. Research has shown that it has positive effects on learning, leading to increased motivation and deeper understanding. Oh, and students love it. But if a teacher has never done inquiry-based learning before, or is something that is only occasionally performed in the classroom, what steps can be taken to fully integrate inquiry into a class's normal routine? Let's see how Andrea does it. Andrea here is an elementary school teacher. This week, Andrea is going to teach her grade 2 class about simple machines.
We're going to talk about the simple machines.
Andrea's background, however, is not in science, and she isn't an expert in simple machines. Before she can teach her class about simple machines, she herself has to become familiar with the topic. The best place for Andrea to start is by looking at the curriculum. This will help her learn exactly what the students need to learn, and perhaps more importantly, what is not part of the grade 2 curriculum. As a teacher, Andrea has limited time, and so doing this will help her filter out what is extraneous. Now that Andrea knows what her grade 2 class needs to learn about simple machines, where can she go to learn and brush up on the content? Textbooks are of course good for this, but in this day and age, some simple online searches can get you some good results fast. Trusted YouTube channels, museum websites, and yes, even Wikipedia can all be useful. Andrea has to be careful though. Some sites like Wikipedia can often bog down topics with very high-level content that might not be relevant to the situation at hand. Andrea shouldn't forget what colleagues and PD they contact she's made as good sources of info.
Hi, Andrea. Hi, Melanie. I was wondering if you had some materials I could use for my activity today. For sure, I have lots of things for you.
Once Andrea feels like she's gotten a good grasp of the content to teach, she now has to find some sort of inquiry activity for her class. Again, lots of activities and things to build can be found online, as well as through colleagues. Soon, what Andrea finds online will spark her imagination and give her ideas of how to link the content to society and the environment, which is a big component of the curriculum. Whatever she ends up finding though, Andrea might have to make her own activity modifications to fit her class's specific needs. As Andrea is searching, there are a few things that she can keep in mind to help her find an activity that is appropriate. For one, in order to save time, it's a good idea for her to search for something that students can assemble rather than for Andrea to have to assemble everything herself. Also, because teachers typically don't have big budgets, one thing Andrea can do is to find activities that don't require many materials and that can be reused from supplies Andrea already has, are available at school or through her school board or that she can buy at a dollar store. With inquiry, something Andrea will be doing is splitting her class into small work groups of no more than 6. Andrea will have to take that into consideration when getting her supplies. Also, Andrea should make sure to design an activity that she is comfortable doing in class. Safety should be a priority. In the next segment, Andrea will introduce a series of activities that will push her students towards open inquiry.
Okay, so I'm going to let you kind of go through the others in your own. Actually, I probably should have shown you video 2, but video 2 really gets into the implementation and how the teacher is talking to students as they go through the inquiry piece as well. And again, it's not a very long piece, so it's pretty. And all of the links, if you bring up the PowerPoint, the red YouTube series piece is a live link for you to be able to get to it. So I'm going to go on to the third one because I wanted to pull out for you what this talks about. The others are a little bit longer, so we're not going to see those today, but they're still only about 7 minutes. But video 3 gets into the skills it takes to become an inquiry teacher. And basically those are being flexible and patient. You know, you've got to give kids time to talk through it. You've got to be able to take questions, and that's number 2. You know, let kids have open-ended questions and then guide those, but not shut them down, nor let them divert from what they're doing. Setting up the expectations that you have for the inquiry. When a kid says, I don't know, or when kids ask a question and the teacher doesn't know, going beyond just I don't know, but how do we then go beyond that and help kids get the answers to the questions? If we continue to say, I don't know, or we don't have time to look that up, then kids get disengaged from the activity. And then just making sure that the activities are truly great activities that engage students and that keep them involved and result in the kind of learning that you want. The fourth series gets into inquiry skills that students need to have in order to do inquiry. And those are skills that really are a lot of the 21st century skills that we have been talking about needing to have kids be able to do. You know, can they initiate an inquiry and plan out how they're going to do the inquiry? How do they do data analysis? So being able to do data recording, being able to keep not only just doing the task, but then how do they record the results of the task so they can use it, and then analyzing and interpreting that data and sharing it with others, which really also brings in all the pieces we've been talking about literacy. So if we look at all of these pieces together for kids, we're really bringing in 21st century skills, we're bringing in literacy skills, and so on. So one of the things that we have in the workshop that we are doing for social studies is we're kind of using the same kind of model we've been using with the C3 project in literacy, where it starts with those inquiry questions and standards first. And that's where we'll be starting day one with the workshop for social studies, is the inquiry standards and questions first. That's the first piece that drives everything. The next piece is the text, and remember, text is more than just printed things, it's more than textbooks. What are the texts we're going to use to help get that information? One of the things you'll see in video 2 is that the teacher needs to kind of whet the appetite of kids and give them enough background knowledge that they can successfully launch into the inquiry. And then we go into the other pieces around that, you know, the text-based questions that we're going to use, the vocabulary, the text-based questions, vocabulary, text, and inquiry standards. Those 4 components are what we'll be doing in days 1 and 2 of the social studies. And then from that piece, we get into what are the instructional strategies we're going to use? How do we scaffold for success? How do we help students with varying needs be able to be successful with that inquiry and with learning the content? How are we going to assess it? And what kind of writing can we do? And writing being very broad again, might be speaking, might be writing a diagram, developing a diagram, etc. But what kind of writing can we have kids use to share the results of their inquiry? So much of what we just saw in the video, much of what we've seen other places is inherent. And on the side, you see just the beginning, the first page of the unit planner that the social studies folks walk through to help them understand all of these different components of really designing a good lesson, instructional design, and also in inquiry design. One of the major pieces that's used in the C3 framework, which is for social studies, is the inquiry design model, the IDM model. And it basically starts with a compelling question and ends with some kind of a summative argument. Remember that, sharing the results at the end, communicating the results, that's the summative argument. The so what? So I've learned about this, I've asked questions about this, I've investigated this, what did I find out? You know, what's the summative argument? And in between them as that carefully designed supporting questions, formative tasks that we're asking kids to do around the inquiry, and the sources that we're using for them to get that. So in the social studies workshop, we've really used that IDM model as it's also embedded into their unit plan. So as they're kind of walking through these pieces, they're pulling out all of those things. So it starts, everything starts in an inquiry-based unit, starts with the questions. The questions drive the inquiry. It's an inquiry, so of course questions are going to be important. But we really need to think about how are we opening up that conversation for kids? What are we helping kids become inquisitive about? How are we helping them become curious? Einstein said, if he had an hour to solve a problem and his life depended on it, he'd use the first 55 minutes determining the proper questions to ask. So I think that's a real key to inquiry in any content, is that very careful development of the questions we're going to use with students that not only guide the inquiry, but help them become motivated for that inquiry. So, that student curiosity should be leading the learning here. And an important component is how do we build that starting point, that compelling question that gets them to want to have the learning. And that's where we capture the kids' interest. That's where we get kids engaged. That's where we help the learning stick. That's where we help even kids who have some other issues and problems become involved at a different level than they may have without that. So it's more about the process of learning. In other words, we're more interested in how students are learning about the content through the inquiry than a product that they're going to produce. So it's not about what they get on a quiz or a worksheet or doing a worksheet. It's more about the kind of thinking they're doing. It's more about the kind of energy they're bringing to the learning. It's more about how they're exploring the content that is important here. And once again, as we saw in the video, or in video 3 talks about, is that willingness to be flexible. That means that we are turning the power over to kids. So instead of us holding the reins and guiding the process, step by step, we're really giving kids the power to be explorers, to be diving into the question, to answer the question, and the pathways may be slightly different. And if you think about it, this is a little bit about what we're doing with the micro-credentials. If you think of the task as almost an inquiry, we're asking teachers to be good inquirers. We're saying, here's where you want to go, but guess what? You don't all have to go down the same path. It's not like an online course that you do this, and then you do this, and then you answer these questions, and then you submit this. Instead, it's a flexible pathway taking very different directions that you may want based on your own needs, based on your own knowledge base, based on the way you learn, and so on. So we as a teacher have a general roadmap and kind of a possible end result, but the group, the kids, individually as a group, as a whole, can kind of tweak and revise that as we go. And teachers need to be willing to allow kids to be able to come up with a different way of doing it. And then to be able to support how they got that different way of doing it, rather than it being there's only one way to arrive at the answer and there's only one right answer. So we want kids to be able to move in multiple directions. So questioning is at the heart of this, and becoming good questioners. A big piece of day 1 of the social studies, for example, is on building questions. One of the micro-credentials for social studies that you could use for others as well is on developing good, essential, compelling questions that help kids organize their thinking and to develop their pathways to learning. Those kind of great compelling questions provide intrinsic motivation. They cause students to kind of say, what are we doing? Why I want to know about this. And that's the biggest piece of inquiry, is if you don't start with the right questions and you don't start with the right frame, then you're never really going to get kids to take that responsibility that's necessary for an inquiry-based process. So kind of a more general kind of view of the inquiry process besides IDM, it follows very similar to IDM, is represented in this chart, where we start about posing, this says real questions. Really, why are we learning this? If you have kids saying all the time, why are we learning this? Then they really don't. Then we're not asking the right questions. We're not getting them to think about real things. And then you want them to go on and think about, what do you already know? What do I know about my question? How do I know it? What do I need to know? What could an answer be? We certainly will provide resources for kids, and that's the whole making sure that they have high quality text sets to answer that question, but also helping kids be able to find resources as well. And then interpreting that information. What am I doing with the information that I gather from my inquiry? How do I know it's valid? How do I know it's supported? What proof can I give that the information, the interpretation I have is correct? And then again, communicating or reporting your findings. Who are you reporting to, etc. So if we think about what a quality compelling question is, we have some questions we might ask ourselves about this. On Thursday in social studies, we'll be doing, one of the things we'll be doing at the workshop is having teachers at the workshop create questions that they will, compelling questions, high quality, essential, compelling questions that they'll be using as the foundation for the rest of the work we're going to do the other days, which is, you know, aligning text with it, aligning writing with it, and going through the whole IDM process, as well as other pieces. So it's very important that we understand what a quality question looks like. How is it compelling to kids, not to us, because we're already interested in the content, but what's a question that would lead students into the content as well. And then another thing to think about, in addition to those teacher-generated questions, we need to start helping kids learn how to create their own questions to guide inquiry. What's a good question? What's the makeup of a good question? How do we, you know, sometimes asking the right question is more important than coming up with the right answer. So how do we help kids learn how to become good questioners as well as good answerers of questions? We know that kids' questioning dramatically drops off after age 4. You know, up to age 4, they're constantly full of questions. Why this? When this? Why, you know, why do you do that? Why do you do this? And, you know, after age 4, they quit asking questions. And it's not that they're less inquisitive. It's like we haven't really helped kids understand that their own questions are as important as our questions. We need to help them see that questioning is a big part of their learning, and that they need to be able to learn how to formulate their own questions and also ask their own questions. So many of you may be familiar with the whole IDM model template, and we kind of use this as a guideline for how we're going to work through as we're going to work through the process in the social studies workshop as well as the unit plan. But it starts with, first of all, understanding the standards. What standards you're teaching. If you noticed in that video, it said the first thing you have to really understand is what's the content. I mean, what are you asking kids to be learning about? And that you're going to develop this question around. What's the compelling question or questions that you're going to ask that help kids, lead kids to that content knowledge? And then what are some supporting questions that might help them kind of get along the pathway in pieces? What kind of tasks are you going to ask them to do? What kind of sources are you going to use to help them answer the questions and to perform the task? And then lastly, what's your summative performance task going to be? What's going to be the big deal at the end that kind of wraps up the inquiry, helps answer the big question you started with, and what kind of action would you want kids to take from that? One of the pieces that we'll also be talking about is, and an important component is staging the question. And staging the question is not just putting a question out on the board, we write it on the board and then we dig in, but it's also, in other words, what's an activity that we might do, or what's some learning that we might do that's kind of a springboard into the inquiry and also generate more curiosity about the topic. So an example that we're using in social studies you see on the screen is, you know, the compelling question might be, did the U.S. develop a just constitution? And, you know, so now we want to get kids more curious about that. And so we might have them as a staging the question activity, you know, draw your vision of the government. What do you think the government is? What do you think the government acts like, looks like, etc.? Not all the pieces, not all the, just naming all the parts of it and the 3 branches and so on, but how does government act in your life? What is your perception of government? So another kind of way of going back to this is we kind of start with the compelling questions on one end, bookend. We end with the summative, argumentative, taking action piece on the other end. And in between, we have developed these kind of some supporting questions, some sources to use, some performance tasks, some doing things that we want kids to be able to do to get to that question. So just wanted to give you, you know, I want you to think about inquiry at the heart of instruction, not just for social studies, but also for every content area. When you walk into a classroom, how are kids being inquisitive? How are kids being asked questions that they're in search of answers for that don't necessarily have a correct answer, but that we are allowed, you see kids investigating. You see kids collecting data. You see kids presenting results. And it's not a clear pathway. Again, I think it kind of mirrors a little bit what we're trying to do with the micro-credentials, in the sense of not a clear, cut and dried, walk here, then walk here, then walk here, but instead we're getting kids to really think through the content and answer those questions that are not only captivating for them, but also motivating. So, anybody have any questions or things you want to add on the inquiry piece? It's kind of one of our learning pieces for today. Okay. So hopefully you have the PDF. We'll also post the PowerPoint, so you have that in case you want to use it for any purpose, or you want to share it with teachers, or whatever. Also wanted to, for those of you who've had social studies teachers go through days 1 and 2 last fall, right? Last fall, no, a year ago. Year ago. Whoa, a while back. That was some of the pieces, and some of the pieces were an abbreviated version of what we're going to be starting to look at Thursday with social studies teachers. Okay.